Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Stephanie Traina from Memorial Hall Library. The Wilmington Memorial Library is also partnering with us on this program today. We're very fortunate to have the Addison Gallery of American Art right here in Andover, and we hope this virtual tour today will inspire you to visit the museum in person. Admission is always free, and the Addison is now open 6 days a week, Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., and Sunday 1 to 5. And their requirement is that you wear a mask at all times when visiting the museum. The exhibit Gordon Wilkins will be talking about today is Language Sequence Structure, Photographic Works by Lou Thomas, Donnelly Phillips, and Hal Fisher, 3 Northern California artists. It'll be on view until January 23rd of 2022. As you could hear, we are recording today's program, and you can put your questions in the Q&A box. I've also enabled live captions, which you can turn on or off at your end. Many of you know, but I'll still introduce him. Gordon Wilkins is the Robert M. Walker Associate Curator of American Art. He joined the Addison in 2018 and worked previously at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine, and the Newberry Library in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Gordon Wilkins.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, as always. Thank you as well to Memorial Hall Library here in Andover and also to the Wilmington Library. It's very exciting to have a new partner on board. So we are going to start. Let me, if I can get the tech. You would think after 2 years of doing Zoom nonstop, you would get the technology down, but there's always room for learning. So as Stephanie mentioned, the show that I'm going to bring you through and hopefully provide some context for is an exhibition called Language Sequence Structure, Photographic Works by Lou Thomas, Donnelly Phillips, and Hal Fisher, which is open now at the Addison through January 23rd of 2022. And again, if you have any questions throughout, I have a hard time speaking and monitoring, but Stephanie will be monitoring the questions and the comments. So do feel free to ask questions and we'll respond to them later. And I tend to go over time, but I will try to keep this to an hour, and I will certainly not be offended if you have to leave at any point, because I quite frankly can't even tell how many people are here right now. So this is the triumvirate that we'll be talking about: Donnelly Phillips, Lou Thomas, and Hal Fisher. This is a wonderful archival photograph of the 3 of them at the signing for Hal Fisher's Gay Semiotics publication back in 1978. This is a fascinating group of artists who are unfortunately, but I think the tide is certainly turning, not particularly well known on this side of the country. And even within San Francisco, are sort of seen as outsider or fringe figures. Hal Fisher, pictured on the right, who's the youngest and arguably the most famous of the 3, has received a good deal of recent attention, and his work is being reconsidered across exhibitions and in publications. But the other 2, Donnelly Phillips on the far left and Lou Thomas in the center, who unfortunately just passed away, are still sort of awaiting critical reexamination. And so this show and a show that preceded it, which I'll mention at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, are really the first shows in over 3 decades to consider the 3 artists together. So my whole journey of learning more about these 3 artists begins with Hal Fisher's Gay Semiotics, which, if you're familiar with really any aspect of queer art history, you're most likely familiar with Gay Semiotics, because it is one of the most canonical works in certainly contemporary gay art, queer art history, really within the history of conceptual art. It's quite well known. I can't exactly remember the first time I was exposed to Gay Semiotics. I can't remember if it was high school or not, definitely not high school, if it was undergrad or grad school, but I remember being taken immediately by the work. And just for its humor, its incredible ability to combine imagery and text in a very compelling and entertaining way. And also just to think that this body of work was first proliferated and shown publicly in 1977, so over 40 years ago, 1 year after California decriminalized same-sex sexual activity. The images are still, I think, feel very much, in some cases, of the moment. They certainly don't feel dated or really antiquated. I mean, they certainly are of the 70s. You can't escape that with the certainly with the fashion that's on display. But there's a timeless, almost timeless quality to these images that really draws you in and really grabs hold of you. So I was familiar with this work. I didn't know how. I didn't know if this work was available. I just knew that when I started at the Addison, and that we really ought to own this work if at all possible. So it was as easy as finding Hal's website and emailing him. He stopped making work in the early 80s and had really another career as a museum professional and as a critic. But he started to reissue his work within the last 5 years. And so we were able to acquire this portfolio, Gay Semiotics, which I'll get into in greater depth later. And then it was really through pure chance that I became more aware about Lou and Donna-Lee. That was because there was this exhibition, which I unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to see, and very few did because unfortunately it was the run of the show was cut short by COVID. But there was a show curated by Aaron O'Toole at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art that opened in 2020 that the interim director, my colleague here at the Addison, Allison Kemmerer, had the chance to see because she was in San Francisco for the opening of Dawood Bey's exhibition at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and came across this show. And I had heard about it, but didn't have a direct sort of firsthand account of how excellent it was. And she could not stop talking about how great the work was. And that sort of opened up this new door and allowed me to eventually come up with this notion of sort of carrying the torch of this exhibition in a much reduced scale. But by acquiring works over the last year, we've been able to sort of bring this exhibition and these 3 artists to the East Coast. As I mentioned, they're fairly well known on the West Coast, although still, as I mentioned, particularly Donna-Lee and Lou Thomas are seen as sort of marginal, or certainly marginalized by the photo establishment, or seen as sort of fringe characters. But this SF MoMA show really legitimized them in San Francisco in a way that they hadn't been in decades. And so we were doing our own small part of bringing the spirit of this show back to life here in Andover and introducing this work to the East Coast. And this work is not well known outside of San Francisco. As I said, if anyone knows any of these 3 artists, it's Hal Fisher, and they only know Gay Semiotics. So it was a great opportunity for us to really broaden the perception. And these are just some installation views. Our show is much more compact than the SF MoMA show, which was really almost a full retrospective for 3 artists held simultaneously. Because what's also unique about these artists, and it's really kind of reductive to call them artists because they were doing so much more than just producing works of art. They were really all critics. They were all writers. Donna-Lee is a very talented graphic designer. Lou Thomas was really a philosopher and a critic and a theorist in a really major way. So it's almost reductive to just call them artists, but they all stopped making what we would consider to be art, with the exception of Lou, who did continue to make work, but not really with the same intensity as he did during this really 10-year period of time between the early 1970s to the very early years of the 1980s, that they were making work and collaborating with each other on photographic projects, exhibitions, and books. And then Donna-Lee and Hal really stopped making work in the 80s. So there's this finite body of work. And that is kind of a curator's dream. It can be really overwhelming when you're dealing with artists who have been working nonstop, as I am working on an upcoming retrospective with an artist who has who picked up her camera in 1969 and hasn't put it down since. So to have this finite body of work is a big relief, because it's often nice to have boundaries in the creative process, and can actually lead to more, I think, increased creativity if you have some sort of set parameters that you're working within. So this show also came about at an interesting time for the Addison, because we're about to open in late November this massive show from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art called Light Space Surface. And this is a show of work produced in Southern California from the 60s on, but primarily 60s and 70s and some 80s, by artists who were associated with the light and space movement, so-called Finnish fetish artists. And these are artists who were working really along very formal parameters. They were really working within the sort of most elemental qualities of art production. So color, line, surface. The artists were experimenting with different color finishes, light installation. So it'll be a very interesting, very immersive, but very formally driven show. So we have the Southern California contingent very well covered on the second floor. So I started to think we should really have a Northern California exhibition to balance it out. So we could kind of show a fuller picture of California artistic production during the 70s. So initially I was thinking of doing a very broad survey of our Northern California holdings, which aren't, which we have some strong, very strong individual works, but we don't have a very comprehensive collection of Southern California, or of really Southern California or Northern California work. So it became an opportunity for us to think about that area of our collection, the gaps in our collection. And I think it would have been a real hodgepodge had I done the survey. So instead, decided to focus on Hal Fisher, because we had just recently acquired Gay Semiotics at that time, and then try to acquire works by Lou Thomas and Donnelly Phillips, and create a show that focused on the three of them and really focused on their dynamic as this really sort of once in a lifetime kind of captured lightning in a bottle moment, where the three artists were in the same place at the same time working together. And it's also an intergenerational story, which I think is rare, unfortunately. Lou Thomas was the eldest, kind of the godfather of the group. He was born in 1932. Then you have Donna-Lee, who was born in 1941. And then you have the baby of the group, Hal, who was born in 1950. So there's this kind of interesting 20-year span that they cover. And it's hard to find this kind of rigorous intellectual and artistic kind of dynamic between artists of such different generations. So it was this really unique kind of singular group that have not received the attention that they deserve to receive. So this show is doing its own small part in sort of rectifying that. I had someone ask me the other day from the school newspaper here at Andover, which is a very good publication, the Philippian. They asked me, what does this show have to do with Andover and with the Addison? And so that's an innocuous enough question, but it got me thinking a little bit about the Addison's own history and our strength in late 1960s and early 1970s conceptual art, and particularly conceptual photography. So the Addison has always had a reputation as being an institution that takes risks, and we've had very distinctive and quite unique directors over the years who have brought their own perspectives and influenced the Addison in very fascinating and kind of idiosyncratic ways. And one of our most beloved and longest serving directors was Chris Cook, who is a conceptual artist as well as a museum professional. And throughout his reign as the director, he really encouraged the Addison to engage with conceptual art. And he himself is a conceptual artist, as I mentioned. And as part of his own practice, he became the director of the ICA in Boston for a year as part of a conceptual artwork. So this is the level of thinking that we're dealing with here. So very much engaged in conceptual art making. And our collection reflects that level of engagement. This is a work by the famed performance artist and conceptual artist Vito Acconci, whose most famous piece is Seedbed, which I will not describe to you on this Zoom call because I don't want to be fined by the FCC. Not that they monitor, well, maybe they do monitor Zoom calls, who knows? But I encourage you to Google that at your own risk. This is a far more benign performance documentation photo piece called Jumps. And this is going to influence what you see later. This is an artist who is taking a very banal movement, just jumping. He's taking his camera and jumping. But he is using the photographic media to chart this motion in a way that really you hadn't seen before. So this is performance documentation. It's also a conceptual piece. He's laying out through text as well, the process that went behind the concept, which at the core of so-called conceptual art is the concept, the idea, and the artwork is in the service of the idea. These are artists who don't really fetishize the object, particularly the three artists that we're talking about today. They were not interested in creating the most impeccably printed photograph. What was key to them was the idea that they were representing, the idea that they were conveying through their work. And artists like Vito Acconci were very much of the same ilk. Here we have language as art, the really purest form of a text-based work. This is Joseph Kosuth, who's still living, born in 1945. This is Water, an Idea, where he's taking the very definition of these terms that are so loaded. And that's another thing that we'll go back to, is the kind of loaded nature of language and how we bring to language our own bias, our own context, our own points of view. So here he's playing with the idea of kind of neutrality and a definition. He's drawing from dictionary sources to define, and then elevating the text to the level of art, presenting it in a way that references more traditional artistic practices and display techniques. What's also great about these two works is that they were personal gifts to Lucy Lippard, who is one of the great critics of this generation and really pioneering intellectual working within the field of conceptual art and feminist art, and also an alumna of Abbott Academy. And this came into the collection as part of a large Addison art drive in 1991, which was really spearheaded by former director Jock Reynolds and celebrated alumnus Frank Stella to really bolster and build up the Addison's contemporary and modern collections. Again, another fantastic gift by Lucy Lippard. So this is all work that's really going on in New York, I should mention as well. That's going to be key to what Lou Thomas in particular is sort of, it's really key to understanding his context, that these were works that were not being produced in California. This is work that was produced in New York. And this, for example, is a really incredible kind of mail art conceptual piece where Saul LeWitt, the famed artist who's best known for his wall murals, but really a pioneer of, I would say, conceptual art, but accessible conceptual art. Conceptual art that the layman can kind of wrap their head around. He sent her a series of postcards with instructions. And so it's this participatory art piece as well. And these are the postcards that she received after she did what was instructed on the card. So you have this set, again, something key in conceptual work is this framework. There's usually a framework of ideas or instructions. If you were here for our Yoko Ono installation, she's working within a Fluxus conceptual tradition where she produces work that's instruction based. And so the artwork is not a painting. It's not a sculpture. The artwork is the instruction. It's not a physical object, it's an idea. So here we have things like, please disregard all previous information and proceed as usual. There's a kind of tongue-in-cheek quality to it. Please delete this block of printing. He instructed her in one to cross off all of the nouns, cross off all the verbs. So this instructive participatory dialectic. So there's a conversation that's going on in this piece as well. And these are all things to keep in mind as we move forward. And again, with photographic work. Adrian Piper, the famed conceptual artist. This is a performance documentation and a conceptual series. She decided to lock herself in her apartment and read Kant's critique of pure reason, or I believe that's. I really hate theory, just to get it out there. I went to University of Chicago for my master's degree, and they just shove theory down your throat nonstop. So again, if I have to talk about Kant again, I will lose my mind. But she read the Critique of Pure Reason over and over again, and she began to feel herself disappearing. So this charts her disappearance as she gets deeper and deeper into the text and feels as though she's sort of dematerializing or losing her own hold on the material realm. And this also she's a very much a feminist artist as well. So the inclusion of her body as the female body and her body and the agency of her body and her ability to represent herself through self-portraiture will be key in understanding particularly Donnelly Phillips's work. So this is the one piece that's not in our collection. I would kill to have this. Eleanor Antin is really an outlier because she was doing this kind of rigorous conceptual work in California at this time. And I won't say one of the few, but one of the major kind of practitioners on the West Coast. This is a fantastic piece. This is just a detail of a much larger piece of 148 photographs that are meant to be read in columns. So each column is a different day. And she, again, is imposing this very rigorous framework, this set of instructions where she's photographing herself in the same positions at the same place, using the same camera and the camera placement every day. And she's tracking this 10-pound weight loss over 37 days. So the piece is called Carving a Traditional Sculpture. So she's thinking of herself as a three-dimensional object and how we represent three-dimensional objects in 2 dimensions, and then adding this commentary on the violence perpetrated and perpetuated against women's bodies, and this whole culture of dieting and of body modification and the sort of constructs that go into defining a woman's own perception of her body. And this is another sort of thing that was going on in the background. But back to the question of how does this connect to the Addison? And I was looking for a direct connection, and I think I came very close to one. So this is a really remarkable work by Douglas Hubler, who was an artist in residence at the Addison back in 1970. And we did a retrospective and a publication of his work. This is a piece called Location Piece. Was really a major pioneer in the field of conceptual photography. This is a work where he was driving in a car as the passenger, I would hope, and he would take a photograph of the driver of the automobile next to or truck next to him, and take a picture of the occupants at the moment that he passed, that his car passed or their car passed him. And so this is a grid. The grid is also very key. These are systems of understanding and conveying information. So relying on the grid to convey these discrete moments, but the accumulation of discrete moments over time, creating this piece. He also created instruction-based work. So this is a publication called Douglas Hubler, and I'll get to why that's potentially an interesting link in just a second, but here's an interesting piece called Variable Piece number 18, which there's this fantastic note on our database where we own this piece, but the piece doesn't exist. It's a set of instructions. This is when this was up, there was a contest, and I think we should restage this soon, where he has punchlines for jokes, and then he invites people who visit the Addison to submit an original text for the 5 jokes that climax in each case one of the punchlines from the above 10. So you could have these, like, I love a parade, but you had to figure out what goes before, kind of like the New Yorker caption contest. And I think we could afford the $50 first prize, but 1970, that's not bad. So the Addison, all this is to say the Addison has engaged with the world of conceptual photography and art for some time. So Lou Thomas was the manager of the bookstore at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, and was very much an avid reader first and foremost, and devoured the latest theoretical texts and conceptual texts coming out of Europe and New England, or sorry, the Northeast broadly, not really specifically New England. But I find it pretty reasonable to think that he would have been very familiar with this publication published by the Addison. And he cited Douglas Hubler as one of his major influences. So there's the Addison's distant potential connection. So we've talked about this larger context. Here's just what was going on in San Francisco at the time in photography. So Lou Thomas was really reacting to a Bay Area photo aesthetic that was rooted in F64 and in Minor White, who came to San Francisco in the 40s to teach. And even though he left and went to Massachusetts after a decade or plus, his presence was and continues to be very acutely felt in San Francisco, and then also in Boston. There's almost a cult of personality around Minor White and all that he stood for, which was really photography that transcended the everyday to appeal to the spirit, to really tap into something that was kind of ineffable, that couldn't be kind of quantified, that had something beyond the photograph could access this mystical realm. These are two works that kind of exemplify that approach. The left is work by Minor White, the right is work by Imogen Cunningham. Again, portraiture that is meant to sort of give you a sense of the spirit, landscapes that evoke something far more than just the barn that's being represented. You get a sense of kind of the sublime nature of the natural world, and getting at these larger highfalutin concepts. There people that followed in their footsteps include Jack Welpot, represented by this photo on the left, and Linda Connor. And I called out both of these artists specifically because Lou Thomas recounts in an interview in 1981 that these two artists found his work to be incredibly shallow. So this is the kind of the photo establishment of San Francisco, working in this tradition that really privileged or held up the quality of the print as almost first and foremost. That you had to have beautifully printed photographs, that the photographs had to convey something about these high-minded concepts of the spirit of the sort of mystical realms that are unattainable or in the without the camera as an intermediary. And this was stuff that Lou Thomas wanted no part of. He really resented the fact that in order to get ahead in the San Francisco Bay Area photo world, you had to produce work that looked like Minor White's work, or was very much in that same vein. Representational photography that, again, had this sort of mystical quality. The bookstore, reading all this theory and seeing what was going around him as very much backwards, or stuck in time, stuck in a different era. And he took it upon himself to shake San Francisco out of this this Minor White haze, and try to kind of shock them into adopting this new cutting edge way of artistic production. So this is a quote from Lou, where he says, "I guess it was around 1971, which is a really watershed date, that I became discouraged with my work, working in a straight format, attempting to produce interesting pictures. I decided I would make one more effort to do something unique in photography or drop it altogether. This effort was, in a sense, the reduction of photography to the level of idea, and that is key to understanding all of this work. Once I began to work exclusively from the basis of the idea, a lot of things opened up, which was December of 1971. This is when I did my first piece called Black and White, which is pictured at the left. Though I wasn't quite sure what I was doing at this point in retrospect, I can see that everything I've done since it was really built on these two images of the one idea of black and white It produced an intellectual system to parallel the system of photography. So this is really the foundation of everything that came after it. This is not in the show, I should note, and is really a keystone work in the history of conceptual photography, where Lou Thomas truly distilled photography, which at that time color was around but not respected. So we're talking about black and white, gelatin silver print photography, kind of high modernist photography, distilling that to its most basic truly elemental level, which is photography is, shades of black. Photo paper is basically, sensitized paper that darkens and with, exposure to light. So you have black and white, and he's distilling it to a diptych, to its purest form. So this was the foundation upon which he built. So he got this framework, and he starts at the bottom, and then he gets increasingly more complicated. But he had to start at the bottom, which he did. And then he moves on to time equals 36 exposures, which is also not in the show, but I wanted to bring in just a few really important works to give you some context. So this is a work where he was also, I should first of all mention, this work is also really about photography as a medium. He's dissecting the medium. And a lot of what he does references photography as well. So you see 36 and you wonder why 36? Well, there are 36 exposures in a roll of film. So he's breaking down these structures that govern a photographer's own output. You're confined to a roll of film of 36 exposures. So 36 is a number that governs your artistic production. But time is a number also. Time is a construct, just like the number of exposures in a roll of film. That's a construct. There's nothing in nature that dictates that. Just as there's nothing in nature that dictates that we should have 12 hours, 24 hours a day, 12 hours AM, 12 hours PM. So he's dissecting these structures that we have adopted and built our systems around, and trying to express them visually through his artistic production. So he says it was not dependent on hidden messages for its depth of meaning. He's not trying to get you to have an existential crisis. It was physical and opaque, its system being nothing more than the systematic exploration of the photographic process and its corresponding structure. So it kind of is like, keep it simple, stupid. This is the essence of photography. This is the essence of humanity. He is looking at these huge themes that are expressed in opaque ways in photographs, but here he's making it explicit. Photography is very much about time. And here is photographic work. These are 36 in each panel, 36 different prints that he's built this diptych out of. So he's distilling it to its most elemental form. So here's the exhibition, a 30-minute intro just to get to, I promise I will not, I will pick up the pace, but I won't sacrifice quality. Excuse me. So this is the intro. So this is in Gallery 109, which is the gallery that's dead ahead as you enter the Addison. So there's a good amount of wall space, which is important with two-dimensional work. We start with the beginning with Lou Thomas. He was also a really prolific writer and published a number of really foundational texts in the history of photo and language. So language being a system constructed by humanity as well. So these are things that he was really interested in sort of dissecting. You'll see this piece on the left in the exhibition. It's called Sink, Filling, Filled, Draining, Drained. And he says that I was thinking of another subject to follow, time equals 36 exposures while shaving, a process I had repeated in the same sink for more than 5 years. When I finished and removed the plug, I recognized the idea instantly. What I should also note is that in 1971, Lou Thomas's daughter was born, and his life really changed dramatically. And he found himself kind of tied more and more to his home. And he began to realize, when he looked kind of analytically at the world around him in this domestic sphere, that he didn't have to leave his house to make work, which I think is pretty radical, because we often associate that impulse with women artists of this generation who had didn't have the choice in many cases to leave the home to do work. Where he is, he did work, but he decided that he didn't have to go out in search of inspiration as the, Minor White going, to Point Lobos, or these artists going out into nature for inspiration. He could just look at his bathroom sink and find profound meaning. So he studied himself shaving, or he reflected on the fact that he spent and had this really intimate relationship with this sink, this totally everyday, banal object. But thinking about how the sink itself can be an index of time. And so you have time. This is about a sink, but it's really about time. And the various kinds of activities or structures that we base our life around. We all wake up, hopefully we all brush our teeth. Some of us shave every day. Some of us are too lazy to do that, or really don't have sufficient beard growth to necessitate that. But here you have someone, how time has so fundamentally altered or impacted our way of life. So here he's capturing time. He's also breaking it up into a grid of 12 and thinking that the significance of 12 in the way that we construct time. And it's also just visually a compelling work, even though it's a sink that's draining, and you see the hair is in the bottom of the sink and then draining running the water to get rid of the hair. He's elevating something that's totally everyday, and kind of, even though he would not want us to read it this way, but kind of monumentalizing the everyday in this work. And so the next work is the work on the right, opening and closing the garage door, two perspectives. He became very interested in perspective and how, trying to bring in multiple perspectives into photography, which is a really hard thing to do, thinking about how do you capture a three-dimensional object in 2 dimensions? And you have to, you can't really do that in one fixed image. So what you'll see throughout the work of these 3 artists is the serial image, having multiple images, having a single work in this case, but composed of 10 prints. So using the fixed image to convey motion. So really referencing the work of Muybridge and the artists who had really tried to figure out how do you convey things like time and motion using a fixed medium like photography. So here he has 2 perspectives on closing the garage door, the outside view and then the inside view. So he's doing this interesting like in and out sort of dynamic with this work, which this along with the sink piece were acquired before Lou's passing. And I was very heartened to know that Lou was very pleased that this show was happening. He of course didn't have an opportunity to see this before his passing, but he knew about it, which I hope that that gave him a little bit of encouragement. Here we have Bibliography, which is a fantastic and maybe the most inscrutable work, the most esoteric work in the group. This is a promised gift of Hal Fisher, who has been a very, very generous and gracious partner as I've worked on this project. This is a screen print, but almost reads as a photograph. And there are photographic works in this series. It's a part of a larger series called Bibliography, where he took the bibliography that he used in one of his early publications. I have it right beside me, Photography and Language, where he took the bibliography that was in the back of the book, and then he photographed it, created a silkscreen, and then reprinted it. And it documents the evolution of his thinking, because you can notice, crosses people out. And sometimes he crosses people out because he totally disavows their ideas. You'll notice that Lucy Lepard, who was referenced earlier, was once on the bibliography, but by the 3rd iteration, which we have here, was removed. But also, this bibliography was sort of the standard. He kind of standardized this bibliography and would carry that foundation of knowledge onwards, and then kind of adapt it depending on the context. So sometimes it wasn't that he disavowed the work, but if the work wasn't relevant to the publication, he would just strike it out. So it shows this evolution of thinking. He's also really interested in the kind of visual banality of the bibliography. It's just a list, there are 3 columns of text, thinking of that abstracted, thinking of text as art, but then also thinking about the signs and signifiers. So semiotic theory, which is really the study of signs and the constructed meaning behind signs, and the great example that I would use is, there's nothing about a stop sign that in nature signifies stopping. We just have assigned our own values and our own context to the stop sign. There's nothing about an octagon that makes you want to stop, but when you combine octagons with red and with the word stop, the sign, literal sign, signifies something much greater than the sum of than its individual parts. So again, how a list of texts, how language signifies something else. Language is always contingent on something else. We connect the words on this page to something else, to the books, which are themselves containers of different ideas. So the bibliography has this meta container of ideas. So if I haven't lost you, I'll continue. He also started NFS Press in the mid-70s. This is how he really began to work with Donnelly Phillips, is they were working at this press, which book publishing is not an industry to get into if you want to make any money. It ran its course in about 5 years, but they left this incredible legacy of publishing these really important early critical photo texts about language, photography and language. And then also, publishing artists like Barbara Kruger and Cindy Sherman really early on in their careers. So again, it was this kind of once in a lifetime lightning in a bottle moment where they were working together and producing these really influential books under the umbrella of NFS Press. So Donnelly Phillips, this is a great photo of Donna-Lee reading photography and language. She worked on this publication with Lou. Lou kind of sourced the material for publications, wrote a number of essays and entire publications. And Donna-Lee also wrote her own publications, but was really in charge of the production of the books and of the design of the books. So here she is reading one of their most influential texts. Donna-Lee came to San Francisco on a Greyhound bus. She has a really fascinating background. She's from Winthrop, Mass, so she's a local. She left Massachusetts, went to the Cooper Union. She had graduate degrees. She's very, very accomplished, had this incredible training, then just kind of left and was involved in the countercultural movements of the 60s, then went to San Francisco and found a kindred spirit in Lou Thomas and gathered as a member of his sort of circle at the Legion of Honor bookstore. And he began to offer her texts to read, reading lists of things to inspire her. And she began to read, and she wrote her own photo criticism. She really gave up photography in the 80s to focus on criticism. So the text and image were always kind of equal in the minds of these artists, particularly Donna-Lee and Hal. And they would both kind of leave the image behind to focus on text as their careers went on. So I just want to read this statement. This is an early draft of the statement to accompany this piece called "What Do I Mean When I Say Red? What Do You Mean?" And so I'll read this because it's quite interesting and I think sets it up better than I could for what you're about to see. What do I mean when I say red? What do you mean? Is a philosophical investigation of the inadequacy of communication. What comes to mind when you hear or use the word red? We cannot imagine red without imagining some red thing or other. What are we looking at? Sorry, the red or the rose. This piece then plays with the areas of miscommunication where I mean apple red, while you mean flag red. So it's this ongoing dialogue that takes place across 18 photographs. And it's meant to be installed all on one line. obviously didn't do well in math if I ended up as an art historian. So I kind of miscalculated, but I got a special permission to hang it in this staggered way so that you read the top line and then kind of serendipitously you have a stop sign. So you stop and then you move down to the fire extinguisher and then read across left to right like you're reading a book or a text. So it's this conversation that takes place between these imagined speakers, and then there are these dialogues that are happening on a sort of meta level. And you have a feminist dialogue going on, a dialogue of art history. Here you have the pair of like luscious kind of cherry red lips next to a red phone, which you have lust on one side and then danger on the next, and how eroticism and danger can be so intertwined. And then you have this unfolding conversation with the text on the bottom, where there's this chorus of what do I mean when I say red? What do you mean? So it's this kind of investigation of how we can all have an idea of what red is, but my red is different from your red. So you could be thinking of red, shades of red that are drawn from consumer culture. So Coca-Cola red. I mean, that immediately you conjure something in your mind. Or Campbell's soup red. It's also referencing art history, where you have the reference to pop art and Warhol soup cans. It's also making literary references, where you have, she's not spelling it out though, which is what makes this great. It's where you have this literary portraiture of Gertrude Stein on the left with this red background and Picasso image, and then you have roses and thinking of Gertrude Stein's "A rose is a rose is a rose." And what else do roses connote? So there's all of this there are layers and layers of meaning. This is one of the more charged and fascinating pairings. And it's not really meant to be read in these discrete pairings. So I encourage you to come and read it as a whole body of work. But here you have Mao's little red book next to the American flag. So two different forms of governance coming head to head. You have the stop sign, danger, the threat the threat of danger, or the potential of danger, and our own ability to mitigate danger through the fire suppression tool on the right. And again, there's also this feminist narrative, this kind of romance, also kind of erotic narrative, where the kicked off high heels and the glass of wine. And then you have emergency, this red curb, for emergency parking only, this sense of danger. And then you have the vacancy of the seedy motel sign. So there's just so much to be read into this work. And here's a list of all of the different ways that red can be expressed in words. Everything from, Harvard crimson to strawberry, and everything in between. So the final artist that I'll talk about is perhaps the best known, and that's Hal Fisher. He was born in 1950, grew up outside of Chicago, went to Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, received a degree in photography, then went for grad school in San Francisco. And that's where he began to work as a photo critic and became friends with Lou Thomas and Donna-Lee. And it was really Lou Thomas and Donna-Lee who encouraged him to make work about his own identity. And so what's great about all of these artists is that even though they're working within sort of a framework that's similar, they're all working with ideas of sequence and language and structure and form and serial imagery, they go about it in very different ways, where Donna-Lee's work is very much influenced by her own feminist convictions. Lou Thomas is really, they all have theory built into it, but Lou Thomas is very theoretical. And then you have Hal, who's bringing his own unique point of view as a member of the queer community in San Francisco at this time to bear on his own work. He's very art historically literate and is drawing in these two bodies of work, and really in his entire body of work, on typologies, on photographs by artists like August Sonder, who set about documenting all of the different kinds of people in Germany in the interwar period, and later German artists like Bernhard Becker, who set about creating, they saw their work more as architectural than as photographic, because they're documenting vernacular forms of architecture and creating these photographic grids. And so he was very much inspired by this, and also 19th century anthropological work. Their work like this often sort of very much racist imagery of artists like of Edward Curtis, the North American Indian, a lot of British ethnographic photography, this kind of ability or desire to utilize the photograph to contain and convey and construct meaning. And the power of the photograph, particularly in a colonial context, was very much in his mind when he was creating work. So here's our installation of Gay Semiotics at the Addison. It's comprised of 24 individual works. People think of it as a kind of unified series, but it's really a series of series. You'll see that we have about 5 kind of discrete groupings here, or 6 really, clumps. The work can be installed in various ways, but as you'll see, there are sort of natural connections between works. Gay Semiotics was also published by NFS Press in 1977-78 and became an instant hit and appealed to a fairly wide audience. So it was not carried at the SF MoMA bookstore. So it was, again, a really quite an amazing turn of events that 30 years later, or more than 40 years later, Hal would be brought back as a star artist at SF MoMA, and they would be selling all of his books in the shop when they had refused to sell his Gay Semiotics before. So this is a pioneering study of visual coding among the gay community in San Francisco, in between during the period of gay liberation, right after same-sex sexual activity had been decriminalized in California, and really before the horrors of the HIV/AIDS pandemic would be fully understood. So it's this fleeting moment of time, this kind of, in retrospect, really, it's trite to say magical, but it was this freedom. But I'll qualify that by saying this is freedom for a demographic of gay white men who could support themselves living in the Castro, which was, we think of it as a gay neighborhood, but it wasn't always a gay neighborhood. It was gentrified by gays, and it's in turn being gentrified by tech billionaires. So you have this study of a very specific period of time in a very specific community within a very specific subculture. But he's approaching it with a great deal of humor. And it works on so many different levels, where he's using theory, he's using the theory of signs and signifiers and semiotics to explore and to dissect this community. But it's interesting because it's work that can appeal to a variety of audiences. So someone just earlier today asked me about what was Robert Maplethorpe doing at the same time. Robert Maplethorpe at roughly the same time was taking very graphic, sexually graphic photographs of what would be considered aberrant S&M sexual behavior. And those images, I think, immediately turned people who were not interested in that community, were not part of that community, turned them off and could be perceived as quite alienating. Whereas Hal made his work very intentionally banal, where you're meant to be drawn into these images that on the surface, although that can't be said for all of them, seem innocent enough, but then you read into it and realize that he's getting at something far more complicated. And that's the way that signifiers work, is that to people who don't know the meaning, it's really this kind of closed system of meaning. If you're outside of that system, a handkerchief is just a handkerchief. But if you're inside, a red handkerchief in the back pocket, right back pocket, means something very different. And so he's analyzing how, and this is the kind of section of gay semiotics that's best known, is the hanky code section. Hanky codes were a real thing. People students have a very hard time understanding this. So in the pre-internet, pre-Grindr hookup days, when you actually had to meet people in real life to find someone to have sex with, these visual codes were used because you didn't want to, wear a sign saying that you were interested in such and such, because you were still operating within a community that is marginalized, and you're in a predominantly patriarchal, hetero, white culture. So you have to kind of find subversive ways of communicating. And it's the whole thing of, the Jack Donaghy quote on 30 Rock, where, a man wearing a red tie in that neighborhood at that hour means something, that he's looking for something very specific. And so that's where this kind of comes out of. So here we have a hanky code, which I was able to borrow. Obviously, these were not meant to be archivally preserved. These were meant to be kind of a pocket reference or a wallet reference, where you're going cruising or going to an S&M bar and you see, a gold silk handkerchief and you want to figure out what does that mean. But some have been preserved, and we were lucky enough to be able to borrow this from the History Project, which is a big LGBTQ archive in Boston. Another section is the archival media, archetypal media image section, where he's dissecting the ways in which gays were, the kind of gay consumption of gay stereotypes or archetypes in media. So you have the natural gay, here you have the leather gay, there's also the kind of urbane gay. So you have these different types. So he's creating this typology, just like Byrne and Hilla Becker were documenting water towers, he's documenting in a very tongue-in-cheek way, because there is a seriousness about this, and that seriousness really has come with historical distance, I think. At the time, it was important because this is work that was not made specifically for the gay community. This was work that was made for a wider audience as well. And he's teaching, really, it's a very instructive body of work. And I think, but with time, when this culture has survived in some ways, but it's very, it has not survived as it was. This was a far more sexually uninhibited time before the sort of HIV/AIDS pandemic reared its ugly head and just decimated this community, where these are really important documents as well as artistic works of a way of life that has radically shifted since these were taken. He's also documenting the S&M community, so looking at subcultures within subcultures, but in a way that's not, it's certainly provocative, but he has this great quote where he's talking about, he wants to lure you in with the banality of the image, where there's kind of an everyday sort of standardized look of these images. But he wants, he says, he imagines little ladies at the gallery kind of looking and then learning, oh, this is about such and such a sect, or that another, so it's really kind of drawing you in and then pulling the rug out from under you in a way. And really, people find this fascinating. I mean, this is fascinating. So people who don't know anything about this community, you can still learn so much 40 years later from this body of work. Again, the eroticism is really suggested. Here he's using dotted lines, almost like a crime scene photo, to illuminate how these bondage devices could be utilized. It almost looks like an IKEA ad. So again, he's referencing this language also of consumption, of advertisements in a lot of this work. And here, I mean, his aesthetic, this treatment has been ripped off, or sort of, that's a very harsh thing to say, but has been appropriated in many ways. So these images almost feel familiar to us, even if you haven't seen this body of work. So here he's analyzing the sort of, again, the types, the basic gay street fashion, the uniform, the leather uniform, and capturing in this very tongue-in-cheek and humorous way. Hal is hilarious. And I should mention that he'll be here on campus at Andover as an artist in residence in December. So we'll make sure there's an opportunity for the public to interact with him. He's hilarious, and they're just hilarious moments in this series. The final body of work, and I know that I've hit 3 o'clock, so I apologize, is this series called 18th near Castro Street times 24. And I should also note, if you look at the dates here, what's great about Hal's kind of post-retirement, he worked at various museums for some time, and after retiring, he's really spent a lot of time on his own work and on Donnelly Phillips' work. I should mention that Donnelly suffered a very traumatic brain injury from an automobile accident in the 1980s. And while she's still very much alive, has not really made very much work or written very much since then for very understandable reasons. So Hal is really focused on his own work and his legacy. And he realized that the prints that they were making in the 70s just will not hold up as time goes on. Again, these artists were not interested in creating perfectly printed works. They were really interested in and invested in sharing ideas. So he has reissued work as portfolios and in set editions. So we were able to purchase the entire Gay Semiotics portfolio and this portfolio of 18th near Castro Street. So that's why you see 2 dates. These are carbon pigment prints. Carbon, we use it for carbon testing because it doesn't really degrade as rapidly as other media. So these prints will stay, well, you know, fingers crossed, will stay the way that they are really for till the end of time, which could come sooner than we think, who knows. So Castro Street times 24 is a not as well known, but deserves to be as well known as Gay Semiotics, because it is a truly engaging, totally absorbing body of work. And this is how the work was presented in a publication, a limited edition publication, and it came out in 1978. So this is a really fascinating work because it's so many different things. It's a performance piece. It's a documentation of a performance piece. It's a text piece. He's really very much following in the footsteps of the sort of new journalism movement that was going on in the 60s and 70s. You know, people like Joan Didion, where the journalist is no longer the sort of dispassionate, unseen, unheard observer. They become part of the action, and it's often told through first-hand perspective, first person. So what he did, the whole sort of concept is that he visited this very popular bench, bus waiting bench, at a very busy corner of the Castro, which is the gay district of San Francisco. So he would return, he drew an X on the ground, so he would set up his camera at the same spot, and every hour on the hour for 24 hours, he returned to that spot to document the comings and goings of what, to see what was going on. So it's this durational piece that unfolds over 24 hours and unfolds over 24 photographs. So again, this sort of emphasis on and sort of reinforcement of structure of, you know, one photograph on the hour. You also notice that there's really not a hierarchical relationship between text and image. There's kind of equal space dedicated to text and image. There's not a hierarchy. So the text is just as valuable and just as important as the image itself. And the text is extraordinarily engaging, and I don't expect you to read it on a computer screen. So I encourage you to come to the show, because on the wall, this is one of the first times that it's been presented all on one wall. So you can just go, it's not double hung, it's on the line. You can go from one to the next, and you're meant to read it like a book left to right. And people will spend lots of time reading every single photograph because it draws you in. And you'll have to take my word for it now, but I encourage you to see it. And this is the first time this body of work has been shown in the Northeast. And it's the first time that Gay Semiotics, which is this iconic work in queer art history and art history broadly, has been shown in New England in its over 40-year history. So we're very pleased to debut this work in New England. It's also great. You start to pick up on some of the same characters who just live at this bench. So you see the kind of quirky looking, very 70s shirtless sunbather, making the older gentleman uncomfortable on the far left, and then slowly being joined by more like-minded people, so that by 2 a.m. he's kind of surrounded by people of his generation who are just kind of hanging out. But you can see this fascinating way in which time also regulates the intersection of people and the mingling of people, where you have, and races. It's a very, really complex body of work, because you start off with this figure of a Black woman in a uniform who she's waiting to get the bus on her way to work. And then you have the elderly white men whose neighborhood is very much changing around them. And then you start, as time goes on, people, younger people come out. They've been sleeping in, they come out later in the day. So you see how time, the time of day really has this major impact on how we interact with other people, and people lead these very parallel and often lives that don't intersect, even though they're occupying the same place, but they're just not occupying the same place at the same time. So again, how shifting meaning, how just like in red, one thing can be different for, red can be totally different for one person. Here, the experience of the bench is changing every hour. So he's documenting, how the environment changes over a period of time. It's this fascinating, close engagement that's so engaging, but also just hilarious. And so he takes, a quaalude in the middle of it, goes off and, tries to pick up a guy picks him up, he goes to a diner. So you get this narrative that takes you out of the scene. So you get, it's this really 3D kind of feeling where you know what's going on behind the camera, and then you see what's in front of you, in front of the camera. And then you also get the sense of this kind of liberated queer culture of 1978, again, really just on the eve of the AIDS pandemic decimating a population. And again, I think it's also interesting to think about this as a really important representation of a moment of time where we tend to, I think, flatten queer life in a way. And because of media and particularly queer representation in media, which in most films about queer subjects, the subject ends up, unfulfilled in a romantic relationship, or dead, or both, in the case of Brokeback Mountain. And to see that, there are moments of joy in the queer community and of relative freedom and this kind of carefree nature that you don't associate, because we've colored our kind of understanding of the past because we know what happens after, we know what's going to happen, and we read it through that lens. Just as we can look at a photograph of the Twin Towers taken in 2000 and see a bird flying near the Twin Towers, but then read that as a 9/11 image, whereas there was a period of time when its meaning was completely, 9/11 hadn't happened, it had no connection. But we apply our own lens, our own meaning over time, and those meanings do change. So again, it's this really fascinating historical document, but as well as incredible work of art. And here's this, I love this guy over 3 images, really just planted there, doesn't know when the bus is coming. And then it ends very enigmatically at the last slide where he doesn't have any text. And it's these kind of clashing of two worlds, these respectable, older, upper middle class figures interacting with this guy who's been hanging out on the bench for hours and hours. So I really encourage you to come and see the show. It will be up until January 23rd. And I know that I've gone over, and I don't know if there are any questions. I don't see any, I don't think, but the chat is open. Oh, there is chat. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if not, I think Stephanie can take it away from here.
Thank you, Gordon.
Oh, and Hal was here this whole time.
Yes, I wanted to. Yes, there you go. I saw him on the list. So one of the artists has been with us today.
Hal has been with us.
All right. So I
I
guess
encourage
if
you to see it in person. Again, I think people are tired of, I'm certainly tired of Zoom. I think now that we can kind of do things with a relative degree of safety. Um, we're never packed to the gills here. You should come and see this work in person. It's really, I think that's critical.
Very good. Well, thank you, Gordon. Thank everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I just put in the chat the next event Gordon will be doing, and we do have two other art programs coming up you may be interested in. So I think we'll say good afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day. And
Yes.
thank you. Till
Thank you.
next
It's a
time.
beautiful day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.